Hey, Quants, I recently had one of my friends ask me about how I build code or build products with AI. And so today, that is what we are going to be covering. Instead of doing a bunch of actual code here, this is just going to be a presentation on the things that I use and my general thoughts on how to use AI effectively today. So let's get into it. So, a little bit of history on some of the different tools that are currently being used. I heard somebody mention this and I thought it was a good way to frame this particular topic. If you've ever written code or you write code for a living, I think you could classify the way that we've developed code into three different generations. And so the first generation was your traditional IDEs, where you basically had everything in under one interface where you would compile code, run the code, test the code. And the common one for that is something like the Eclipse editor. There were other ones like Visual Studio and those type of products. The next iteration was more of a plug and play type of iteration. And so this is when Sublime Text became popular. It was my editor of choice for a number of years. And then towards the end of that, well, I won't say the end, but kind of the culmination of that, we ended up with VS Code. And so VS Code became my next editor of choice, and I used that for multiple years as well. And while I'm not directly using VS Code now, I do use Cursor, which is essentially a clone of VS Code. And so I still sometimes would like to go back to that, with the exception of what I will get in now. And so that is the Gen 3. So this is just a screenshot. I'm just going to show the screenshots rather than try and jump around to different screens of these editors. So this is the VS Code editor. If you've ever written code, you probably use this one because it's free. And it was a very popular choice for a long time. So next, we're getting into the third generation. And these ones really revolve around how you orchestrate your AI agents, as opposed to at the end of Gen 2, you had VS Code and Cursor, where they start including things like Copilot, or in Cursor's case, the ability to select different models or agents to run against your code. That in itself was very powerful, and it was the way that I was working for probably the last almost 2 years now. But we've seen a new iteration of these models, which comes alongside of, or which comes along with tools like Codex, and then so Codex is a popular one. T3 code is another one that I'll mention. Is actually the one that I tend to use the most now. It's probably one of the least feature-rich examples at this point, but I really like the individual that's building this particular product. He moves quickly, and he tends to build things that I think work well. I'll mention another one, which is Nimbalist. I found Nimbalist recently, and apparently Nimbalist has been around for a few months, and it looks like it actually has quite a few features that some of the other tools are missing. But the UI is ugly. And so just for myself, I like working with pretty things. And so even if it's one of the reasons I always hated Eclipse and I never got into Eclipse. I would always choose something like Visual Studio. I thought Visual Studio was a very pretty editor when I was working with things. And so even when I wasn't able to use it because it didn't support the tools that I was working with, or I wasn't allowed to use it in the environment that I was working in, it was always my preference when I was doing side projects or something like that. And so with that said, T3 tends to be one of the prettier ones. Cursor is actually, they have a new agent version that is similar to this, which is called Agent, they call it Glass. I don't know if they call it Cursor Glass or just Glass, but it actually looks pretty similar to T3 code here. It has more features than T3 code, and I'll get into some of that stuff a little bit later. Excuse me. I'll try not to cough in the microphone too much, but am coming just getting over a little bit of a cold, so try to get through this without coughing too much into the microphone. So the idea behind these, and I'll spend a little bit more time here since this is really the thing that I tend to use, and I'll get on that a little bit more later. But what you end up here is you end up with basically a list of projects, and under your projects, you then have your individual chats for each project. One of the caveats that I don't particularly like with this, and I think Cursor or Codex, one of these has come out that recently allows you to add files that are outside of that project directory. One of the benefits of being able to utilize these tools, and when I say tools, I just mean AI tools like Claude Code, or Cursor's has theirs, the Cursor agent, or Codex, is that you can reach across multiple files. And so you don't have to be stuck in a single project and say, and then copy some files over to give it the context that it needs to be able to do the work that you want it to do. And so a good example of that would be, you have a project that you already finished and it has like some authentication feature that you like. For example, maybe use Clerk, and you want to utilize Clerk in a new project that you're using, but you don't. I will say most AI agents are going to get this right at this point, but in the beginning it might not have got that configuration right, and so you would just be able to reference your previous project and say, I've already implemented this in a project, go look at that project and then do it here for this project. And so now you're spanning the knowledge or the ability, the context essentially that this agent can use across multiple projects. And so one thing I will say with these current generation of tools, you can still point to files outside of the project that you're within. And so it's just, they're not always, they don't have an efficient way to be able to do that. I think one of them, maybe Glass, has a way to add a folder, and then you can add a folder as a reference folder from an external project. And so they're evolving so fast, but I will say, conceptually, this is generally how I like to work now. And so you end up with these different projects. So if you've been watching any of my videos, I've released the Just Quant Alchemy app just as a fun thing around April Fool's Day. I did the Click Alchemy, which is still available in how I produce all my thumbnails and titles and descriptions for the YouTube content that I put out. The Crown Quant website, if you've used any of those products, there's that. And then my base Quant Alchemy website, they're all under here, right? So this is generally the tool that I use. But this is the third generation of tools where it's really you're orchestrating the tools as opposed to simply building within a single IDE, excuse me, or a single project, and you get multiple iterations. So let's go ahead and go on to the next one, because I will get into that a little bit more. So as I mentioned, my current stack, the way that I tend to develop now is that I'm almost always doing everything agent first. The agents can just write code faster than me. I'll get into my opinion of the code that they write a little bit later, but I use Git as the source of truth. I have GitHub in here. I'm not tied to GitHub specifically. GitHub has a lot of good integrations, and so it works well, but other tools like GitLab, and I know a lot of people with some of the issues that have happened with GitHub lately are moving away from GitHub. And I like to see that competition. I have been on, in the past, I used to use GitLab solely just because I didn't want to be, I just found a lot more value there when they were, actually it was the case when they were allowing you to create repositories, private repositories for free. And then I just never moved back to GitHub when GitHub was acquired by Microsoft, and then GitHub allowed you to also have private repositories for free. But I recently did move back to GitHub just because some of the integrations with some of the tools just happen on GitHub first because it's just more popular. So Git-based source of truth, that also allows me to roll things back easily if the agent jacks anything up. I don't have to worry about unwriting the code or worrying about the agent being able to unwrite its code. I can just do a git checkout or something like that to blow away that work. PR-based workflow, I think that's just been common for everybody. If you don't know what a pull request is, then you can use AI to help you figure out what that kind of information is, but it's pretty much how everybody's working if you're working on in something like GitHub and that. So review layer, this is actually one of the most important layers in my opinion, And I do hear people talking about it, but I haven't heard many people talk about how we'll get into how I incorporate this. And so using something like greptile or CodeRabbit is very important in my opinion, because even though we have these super powerful models, the frontier models like Opus 4.6, 4.7, or Codex, or whatever will be coming after that, or Codex 5.4 or 5.5, and these models are extremely good at writing code, I find that there's a lot of bugs that they still introduce into their code that they just are not very good at catching. And so I found that tools that are built specifically for looking for these bugs, like greptile or CodeRabbit, just do a much better job at finding that. And so part of it is just using the right tool for the right job, right? I imagine if you spend some time training a specific instance of Codex or one of the Opus, one of the Anthropic models, to find these bugs, you would probably have success with that. But where do you want to spend your time, right? Are you spending time reviewing code? And we'll actually get into where I feel like I'm currently now spending most of my time, and where I think most people who are orchestrating agents are going to be spending their time. But it's a matter of where you're going to spend your time. And so at the end, once I get something pushed up, it's been through an iteration of AI catching all the errors that it can find, and AI writing all the code that it believes it can write. One thing that I think some people might be doing, but I'm not doing, is just throwing code out and saying, hey, here you go, it's all done. I still believe there should be a human validating that, especially if you're charging money for particular tools. I think you need to have a human in the loop there to validate things. That might not always be the case. I mean, half the time when I validate stuff, everything's good and then it's just fine. And so, that's just more proof that maybe we need less human interaction. But I still think, for me, being able to sell something to somebody, I want to have the confidence that I've actually put my eyes on it and my hands on it, and I know that it works. And so if you think back to that screen that I had before, where you had the multiple agents, I'll just kind of go back there for a second, actually, to pull this up. So if I'm working in a particular project like Crown AI, for example, and I have multiple instances going on, how do I keep those from clashing into each other? Because you can't really change code unless you know it's 100% not going to touch any files that the two agents that are working at the same time aren't going to touch the same file together. Then you need to make sure that, unless you're 100% sure that code's not going to clash and it's not going to end up overwriting code that the other agent is changing, you need a way to manage that. And so work trees is a reasonable solution for that. So if you don't know what work trees are, it's basically a copy of your Git branch, and so you can end up with multiple copies of that. And so it can make changes to its own local copy. Work trees in itself still has some issues, and so that's the caveat that I have noted here. So if you're still using, I've seen some other solutions around not using env files, but using some other tools so that you don't end up accidentally checking in an env file and exposing all your private keys to anybody who has access to your repository, which, if it's private, it's probably not that big of a deal. But if it's a public repository and you do that, obviously that could be a big problem. And now you need to go rotate all your keys. And so that's a simple mistake to make. And so one of the problems with work trees is most of the tools today, they are trained to not look at those files because they're intended to be protected files. And so even though they might be referenced when you run your code, the AI agents are generally trained not to look at those. And so when you create a work tree and you create that copy, those env files don't get copied over. And so oftentimes what will happen is you'll create a work tree, and then the agent won't be able to verify the code because it doesn't have the env files to be able to run the code. And so I've seen multiple ways to try to address this. Nothing that I've been satisfied with just yet, but that's a particular pain point that you might have to deal with if you're doing a lot of parallel agents using work trees, and then you need to make sure that the env files are copied over. Once they're copied over, it's fine. Things can just go the same way they would normally go. But another thing I will say about that is just in my own, for my own use case, and I've seen other people that seem like they generally do a lot of work with orchestrating agents and that. I can work across multiple projects fairly efficiently. I have a really hard time working across having parallel agents in the same project without creating issues that I just don't want to deal with. And so oftentimes I will just work serially because the agents are working fast enough to write the code. The bottleneck ends up being myself. And so this is also the other point that I have on this particular slide here. In most cases, humans are still the bottleneck, and that goes back to my point about I still need to have my hands on it. If I'm going to be building something that I'm going to charge people money for, I still need to have my hands and eyes on it so that I have confidence that I'm selling something that I've have trust in. And so the bottleneck for me usually isn't getting the code written fast enough. It's really me being able to validate it fast enough. And so I might run 2 parallel agents in one code base at a time, but that would be the max that I've generally done. I'm sure you could do more if you have very distinct work that would work well in multiple work trees, totally fine. But just for myself, I have other projects that I'm working on at the same time, so I tend to just find it more efficient to me rather than creating a bunch of parallel work trees. I might create 1 or 2 different work trees, and then I'll jump into another project, and that's how I'll do my context switching instead of context switching inside of the same project. I found that to be more effective for myself. So coming into my opinion of what AI tends to be very good at. So I think AI has become, and I think most people who have ever used AI are now at this kind of a point where they agree AI is generally good at writing code. It writes code very fast, faster than I'm generally going to be able to produce code. And I used to consider myself pretty quick at writing code, especially if it's a code base that I'm very familiar with. I could usually just crank out code. But AI is just, it's just faster, right? It doesn't stop. And so the way that even these super smart models, the way I would categorize them right now is that I would consider them as good mid-level developers. I would say they are getting on the cusp of senior level developers, but the reason I say that is because the code that they generally write is, in most cases, not as refined as the code that I would personally write myself. But it's code that I would say consider good enough. So if you've ever managed a team, this kind of comes back to the point of like, what are you doing now with all these agents? Are you managing the agents, and that's what I consider, since this is a video about how I'm doing it, that's what I mostly do myself now is I'm just managing these agents. And so it feels like I'm managing a team of, mid-level developers. In some cases they do a really good job and you can be impressed. And then but I would say as a general rule, they seem like they're very good mid-level developers. The code that they write is generally good enough. And so I'm not going to nitpick every single architectural point about the code that they write, because at the end of the day, I still want to release projects and individual or different products. And just like when you're managing a team, you are trying to get particular things done, then you don't need to nitpick every little single detail that would as you might do if you were just writing the code yourself. And so that's kind of how I frame agents today. They are so all those sub bullets basically fall under there: the scaffolding, refactoring, repetitive plumbing, all that kind of stuff. They're all really good at that stuff, right? Reviewing code. In this case, I say sometimes, because as I mentioned, if I build a feature and then I ask another instance, and I would use another instance so that it has fresh context and it's not being polluted by the idea that it created the plan and it's like, oh, I already created this plan, so I just know I'm right. I would use another instance. And I ask it to review the code to find any issues. Generally, what I've found is that it misses most of the issues that a tool like Greptile or CodeRabbit would find. And so that was my point about it can be good sometimes. I think if you spent the time training one of those models to identify those particular issues, it would probably do a pretty good job. But when I run these tools in an automated fashion on GitHub, I still find that a lot of these issues are being caught. And so I prefer just to use those tools rather than trying to spend time training a tool to replace Greptile or CodeRabbit. Those tools can get fairly expensive. And so depending on how you're using them, at some point it would probably be more efficient to just train your own model, but it depends on what you're, how much of that tool you're using, I suppose. And so just coming back to this other, to the point about humans still need to be in the loop, in my opinion. So tools, they tend to be very good when you have something that they can validate against. And so in most cases, people are going to validate against the tests that the AI also wrote. And so this is my point that I put on here about, do you trust your tests? Just because you have your tests and the AI can go write code to meet those tests, depending on how you wrote those tests, the value of that can be hit or miss. And that's the same even when you're building enterprise level software or something like that. You might have team building a whole suite of tests, get you to 100% test coverage, and then a new feature comes in and it's just completely different. So the tests that you've already written might enforce the fact that the code needs to work the same, but the feature has evolved such that the code works different now. And now you need to write a new test, and now you have a new test that's validating how the code works. And you can have bugs in the test the same way you can have bugs in the code. And so same is true here. So I have this other bullet point up here I just want to touch on. So I see some people mentioning that they just get these one-shot, awesome code base implementations, which sounds great, and I have rarely seen that happen. But it's not like it never happens, right? And so this goes back to one of the points it's very good at. One of the things it's very good at is refactoring code. I had an old code base that was written in Next.js 12.x. I don't remember exactly what version, and I wanted to update that to 16. And this is something that probably would have taken me about a week to accomplish, validating everything as I'm going through it and making sure that I understand, which pieces I need to update from 12 to 16. That was kind of my high level estimate. And I ended up running this through AI. I think, did the work. It was probably 30 minutes. I don't even think it didn't even get hung up once. It just flew through the whole thing. And then when I loaded everything up, of course, I did the manual validation, which took me another couple of hours to actually go through and manually validate everything. I didn't find a single issue. And so that was one of the moments that I was just really wowed by what AI can do. And so it's not like it can't do these big one-shot type of things. That was a fairly large project. It had payments and billing and all this kind of stuff, user management and all this built into it. So I was pretty impressed that it was able to do that. But for the most part, I do not see that being the case of what it normally accomplishes. So for most things, I think having same way you would build, even if you're using humans, small targeted features tend to be the case. Now, I don't know if that is a human limitation or an AI limitation. And as you get these feedback loops going, I think that you will be able to increase that. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So let's go ahead and move forward here. So this is kind of where I spent most of my time trying to figure out how to refine my process. And it was really the feedback loop. And so I mentioned in my stack, I would use something like T3 code to build different features and that. What I found, and I played with OpenClaw and all that, and I enjoyed those particular projects. But what I found that I was spending most of my time was basically getting feedback from Greptile in GitHub and then prompting the agent. So like use OpenClaw or something like that if I was walking around, so I didn't have to be at the computer, and I'd be like, hey, go look at GitHub. There's some feedback there. You need to address that. or I'd even ask it. I'd say, hey, is that something we need to address? Because sometimes just because we get that feedback doesn't mean that it's necessarily something we need to address. And I would let the AI decide if it was something that was viable to be addressed or not, or have some kind of a conversation around there. But I just found that I was spending most of my time telling one agent to go talk to another, to go review the results of what another agent said to fix it so that it would kick off the other agent to review it. And so that was where that part was one of those tedious points that just was like, as a software developer, you know that this part can be automated and you don't want to spend your time doing it. I think when you're a software developer and there's an easy, I won't say easy, but there's a simple automation. Simple doesn't always mean easy. Good talk if you haven't heard that talk before by John Hincke. I think it's John Hincke. But the point is, finding there's a simple implementation to address this, and you don't want to just spend your time telling one thing to look at another thing and then just doing that over and over again. It gets very frustrating. And so I spent some time trying to figure out how to create this feedback loop. And the way that I have found to work fairly well, and this is actually one of the reasons I still use OpenClaw. Hermes is out now. I haven't used Hermes myself. It looks interesting. It's something I want to check out, but there's only so many hours in the day. And so this is one of the things that I still find you wouldn't using something like OpenClaw is pretty useful because it's easy to set up these type of communication events. And so with this feedback loop, what ends up happening is I will submit, or my AI agent, whoever's writing the code, will submit a PR up to GitHub. GitHub will, that PR will be picked up by Greptile or CodeRabbit. They will provide their feedback loop. And then this is the important part. You have a webhook that will issue off of GitHub, and OpenClaw or whatever agent you want to use. I haven't looked at Claude to see if Claude Cowork could handle this, but I wouldn't be surprised if you could set this up in Claude Cowork. And so you have a webhook that's picked up by something like OpenClaw, and then it gets that feedback automatically, and then it addresses it, pushes the PR back up with the PR feedback back up to GitHub, which kicks off another iteration of a review from Greptile or CodeRabbit, and then that loop just continues. And so what I'm looking for here, I really like Greptile because they've come up with this it feels like gamification concept, right? And so when they do a PR review, they'll give you a score, and that score is out of 5. And so, of course, from a game standpoint, you want to get 5 out of 5. And when you're using agents and it's not costing you effort, and there's cost associated with running the agents to do this work, but there's no reason, in my opinion, to not just generally shoot for a 5 out of 5 every time, right? And so that way, what you've identified is that you've had one of your coding agents write all the code. You've had one of your testing or code review agents validate that there are no known issues with the bug, and now is the most efficient point for you as a human to come in and spend your time reviewing the code. And so that's basically what my loop looks like now. And so when I do this, I just put some images on here. If you set up webhooks in GitHub, you go under webhooks and you'll just see these checkboxes. And so once you name your webhook, you'll have the issues and comments. You've got the pull requests. You do need to set it as active. And so I will turn this on and off depending on if I want to get that feedback loop. If I don't want that feedback loop, because sometimes I'm in the middle of an iterative cycle that I wanted to push up code, but I don't want to pay for Greptile to come and review that code. I'll turn this off, and then I'll turn it on when I'm ready for that iteration cycle to occur, and I'm shooting for that 5 out of 5 so that I'm ready for whenever that's done for me to come in and take a look at do the actual manual validation here. And so I've got the loop here. So point is here. I prompt the agent. If you're going to be doing local testing, I mean, I'll generally do that if I'm at my computer. If I'm not, then I might prompt OpenClaw or one of my remote agents. I use the Cursor remote agents sometimes to go up and push up code. You get that Git PR up in GitHub. The review layer is going to be your greptile or CodeRabbit. So I put the snail here because local testing can take a while because that's usually human validation is how I'm going to do it. And then the webhook and review feedback. I did the 5 out of 5 because in greptile I'm looking for 5 out of 5. And then once I have 5 out of 5, I know the codes should be working. AI thinks the code is working, and greptile believes there's no issues with it. Then we get back to the slow part again, which is the human bottleneck, and that's the manual validation. And so I'll pull the branch down, or I'll use the Vercel preview environment, however you have yours set up. And then generally I like to it can be a little bit of a challenge to set up your Vercel preview environments with everything, depending on how many moving parts you have. If you have payments set up, user authentication and all that kind of stuff, and you want that to work in a preview environment, you have to think about how you're going to set that up. And so I generally spend the time up front so that I can use a Vercel preview environment for that kind of stuff. But once I do that, then I'll have the preview environment that I can test it at. But it's got the snail here because that's, again, the slow part. But AI is working as efficiently as it can now because now the two AI agents are working together to get to what they believe to be a known good state between the two of them. And I come in later as the bottleneck. And so so that's the loop. I think that's where I spent my most of the time there because I think that's the most important piece. And I think that's where most people are going to wind up, is creating some kind of a feedback loop like this until we get to a point where we can figure out how to remove humans. And I think one of the ways humans could potentially be removed in the future is just by the continual iteration improvement of these AI models. As they continue to get better, people are just going to trust them more. And it might be the case that we just grow accustomed enough to using AI that we're just going to trust them. We're going to push code. We're just going to push out production code, and it's going to be fine. And if something breaks, we're just going to prompt the AI to fix it, and it's going to go through that loop and push it out and fix it. And so, in a fast-moving, iterative environment, that's probably totally fine. What I will say right now, I don't like that because I don't want people feeling like something breaks and then there's, I just don't want to know that there's the potential for something to break there. I want to at least feel like if it broke, it was something that I missed, not something that the AI missed. So that way I can take ownership of that. But once we have some potential, you could likely put monitoring on your system as well. And then if that monitoring picks it up, then it just automates the feedback loop of even going out and creating the prompting for the agent. So that's getting on to a little bit farther on, maybe what we could talk about in the conclusion. So let's go ahead and move forward here a little bit. So I did talk about the different iterations of the IDEs or the tools that you use. So I use mostly the Gen 3 tools. I talked about this a little bit in there, but they're still lacking some things, in my opinion, to make them full IDEs. I prefer using T3 code at this point. If I'm not using T3 code, I usually use Cursor Glass. I think Cursor Glass is a little more feature rich, but I do like I just like T3 code, and so that's the one I've been using. Some of the things it's lacking is you can't view files. So it has a button in T3 code. It has a button to open files in Cursor. And so that brings you back to the flow of kind of the Gen 2 style where you're looking at files there. Mostly I'm reviewing the diffs. You can still review the diffs in T3 code. And so I'll review the diffs there. Cursor is, in my opinion, probably the closest as far as like getting all of this right, because you can view the files there. Not in the glass view, I believe. I'm trying to think. Actually, in the glass view, they did update it, so you can view the files there. You can view the code diffs there. I believe they also have the browser integration there as well. And so with the browser integration, now you have your agent orchestration layer. You have the testing, and for the code that I'm talking about here, it's mostly JavaScript, web pages, and stuff like that. Obviously, if you're doing standalone. type of applications, then you're going to need something else, some other type of simulator, or maybe it's just spinning it up live, but it doesn't have a browser type of environment like you would expect with doing doing web style applications. And so for most of what I do, it's web style applications. So you need the browser window, and then that gives you the ability to execute and validate there. And so most of those are missing one or the other. Cursor Glass is by far the closest that I've seen. What was the other one? Nimbalist was the one that was pretty close. It doesn't have any browser integration that I've seen yet. So I think Cursor just kind of blasted past them with their release of Cursor Glass. And so what I'm hoping to see T3 Code kind of catch up with that, because I think, again, I like the individual building that. I think he's doing best job in terms of making the UI work the best and the most performant. And so I would like to see that product succeed, but that doesn't mean it will. And if I had to pick an alternative right now, it would be the Cursor Glass implementation. So yeah, and then I would still say there's also the working with environments when you need to manually copy over environment files. That's just really inconvenient, and it's like one copy command, so it's not a huge effort to do it. But if you're going to kick off a work tree and then go tell your agent to do that, and then you need to manually at some point go in there and do that, like make sure that you get that over there, it just seems like a huge gap in terms of what should be automated. Back to my point about it, if you're a software engineer, you don't want to be doing these little tedious tasks that could be handled with some simple automation. So I already touched on this. So Cursor Glass is probably the strongest. Nimbalist is very close in terms of what they have. They're missing the browser integration. T3 Code is by far the farthest behind in terms of having these other features, but I personally prefer the UI, the feel of the UI. And so that's where I found myself. But I would probably recommend for anybody else getting started that they try Cursor Glass if they don't want to go bleeding edge with T3 Code. So back to kind of what I started to touch on there. And so if I was going to tell anybody what is kind of starting off here, I would want to call out the point about this feedback loop, because I feel like that's been what's increased my velocity significantly. And I feel like that's where most people are going to land, just once they get very accustomed to working with AIs. Even when you're starting to orchestrate and manage multiple AIs, you really need to get that feedback loop going so that you're not doing menial tasks, just prompting one agent to talk to another agent. And then when you get to your computer and you sit down, you're ready to go, just validating stuff to make sure it works and addressing any issues that are remaining as a result of that. And even when you address an issue, that can introduce other issues. And this is generally how I spend most of my time. Is I would find an issue, I'd tell the agent to go fix the issue, and then it'd push it up, and then Greptile would find a bunch of other issues related to the code that they just pushed. And so I don't want to have to come back and say, oh, well, you missed this again, right? And so I just let Greptile and whatever AI agent I'm using work together to figure that out. And then when it's all back to being 5 out of 5, and the code we've got the code working the way that we think, the AI agents believe the code's working the way it's supposed to, and the AI also believes there's no bugs, then I come back and I get a chance to look at it myself, and I'm not wasting my time just telling the two AIs to work together. And so I think so. Yeah. So I would start with one of the AI or Gen 3 type of editors. So the easiest one to recommend is going to be Cursor Glass, because it's the most full featured now. They're going to have the most documentation. And so I would suggest somebody starting with there, trying to wrap your head around working with agents and multiple agents is where I think most people are going to land. So it's going to feel a lot more like management. And one thing I will say is I personally, when I was doing management, it was not my favorite thing. I didn't feel like I was getting the same satisfaction. I will say I feel like I went back to doing mostly development, what felt like mostly development. But then with all the evolution of AI agents, I feel like I've just naturally fallen back into management again, where I'm managing AI agents, but I don't feel the same I feel before I didn't feel a level of accomplishment as a manager, and I doing what I'm doing now with all working with all the agents, I do feel the sense of accomplishment, and I'm not sure if that's the result of the iteration cycle that happens with AI agents just being so much faster. Once you tell an agent to do something, it writes the code so fast. And so even though I have this feedback loop, I find myself at the computer constantly validating all this stuff. It's still generally my ideas telling the AI what to go do and then making sure everything works and then pushing it out. And so the feedback loop is just much faster than what I felt like I was dealing with when I was managing, 10 or 15 plus engineers, trying to do different things. And then at the end of a sprint, you'd have marginal work. It felt like marginal work to review. And I don't want to say that like that was that's the work that they were doing was marginal. It's just like the process felt slow. Whereas like an AI agent right now goes out and writes all this code in a matter of 30 minutes, and then you have a whole bunch of stuff that you can go review. And so as opposed to waiting for 2 weeks to go review all that work, right? So it just feels a lot faster. And I think maybe that's why the sense of accomplishment feels like it's there. Yeah, don't get them. I wouldn't get. There's so many models out there. I wouldn't get overwhelmed with this. This is another benefit of using something like Cursor is you can just select which models that you use. I would start off with their auto model. It's usually pretty good, and then if you feel like you want to expand out from there, you can pick one. But I mean, I hear people always talking about, oh, you have like Opus is the best. You have to use the best. And personally, I've seen some people talking about this, and my personal experience is that I find working with Codex is actually as good, if not better, than Opus. Where I will go back to something like Opus is when I'm doing design work. I still believe that hands down, Opus is the best at design, but I don't feel like it's always the best at coding. And then setting up this loop, although it sounds simple, can be complex. And so I wouldn't tell somebody just starting off to go build your feedback loop. That's going to feel like over engineering. You're going to build this feedback loop, and you're just now starting to work with agents, so it's probably overkill. However, I do think it's important that you start thinking about this now, because once you get comfortable with working with agents, which I think will happen pretty quickly, then you're going to want to figure out how to automate all these menial tasks. Once you start noticing that you're trying to figure out how to get two agents to talk together and do that kind of thing, then you're going to want to have some kind of a feedback loop so that you're not the bottleneck of two agents talking together, because that can be feel extremely slow when it can be quite fast. And so the keeping PRs human testable. So because, and I also put in here, not necessarily small, because I did mention that I've had some use cases myself where the PRs were like the conversion or upgrade of Next.js from 12 to 16. That was a ton of code that changed. However, it was a code base I'm familiar with, and I was able to go through and test everything and feel confident that I was releasing a product that was still stable. And as a result, I haven't seen any issues since I did that most recent one. I don't think that they necessarily need to be small, but I do think it needs to be in the scope of what you're going to be able to test. And so if you end up with all this code that you're unable to test, you're likely going to feel overwhelmed. And if you don't know the code well enough to know what you're supposed to test, you can also put yourself in a bit of a pinch as well if you want to be that person that is taking ownership of reviewing the code before it gets out. Because if it's too big and then you don't even know what to test to know if it did it right, then you're likely just going to end up hitting that merge button, and then we'll end up in the world where I mentioned before is like AI is just putting it out, which maybe that's okay for your particular product or your situation. If you're okay finding those errors that you overlooked or that you didn't bother to look for in production, and then you just prompt AI to go fix them. I don't know what world you're going to end up with there. Eventually AI might catch up, and then it might not matter. But right now I think you could paint yourself into a corner if you do that today. Using the review tool. So I think that's important as part of the loop I mentioned. I will say CodeRabbit has a CLI tool that I think you could integrate as well as part of the loop, so you're not using the webhook through GitHub. I like that concept. I did play with that a little bit, but I was still finding issues after submitting it up to GitHub, and so I just pulled that out of the loop because it's like I was going through the cycles on the CLI, and then I was still hitting cycles on GitHub, and then I just had two places where I was creating a cycle, and so I was like, I just want one place where I'm hitting that cycle. All right, this is turned out a little bit longer than I want, so hopefully my voice is going to hold up here. And then optimize for manual validation speed, not one-shot perfection. And so that just goes back to the keeping the PRs human testable, right? So you really need to be able to, in my opinion, you really need to be able to know what you're going to be testing here. And so I will mention, I put a note here, this can get expensive with greptile and CodeRabbit. So if you turn on that, if you set up your greptile, for example, to review on every commit, you're going to trigger a review, and then you can incur cost every single time your two AI agents are talking together, and that can get very expensive. And that's also why I mentioned before that you might turn that off if you know you're not ready for that level of iteration and you just want to manually prompt it, which is how I started off as well. But now I've gotten to the point where I'm comfortable with how much it's going to iterate. And if I'm doing something, I'm just starting off a new project, for example, and I know it's going to iterate a lot, well, then I will just turn that off until I get the iterations done that I'm comfortable with, and then I'll turn it on and let the two AIs basically hash it out so they get to a kind of a steady state. So that's going to be it for that. There was quite a lot there. So I did talk about I don't think AI is completely replacing developers. I think developers are shifting more to this orchestration layer. We're orchestrating them and then figuring out how to iterate quickly. I do like this kind of idea here. The better you loop, the better your outcome is. And so those feedback loops, when they work, they feel amazing, and they do feel somewhat like a superpower because you find a ton of issues that you might not have caught yourself as a reviewer. And you didn't even have to step in the middle. And so if it really does, that does feel very good when they basically come to a steady state and you have a 5 out of 5 and the code looks good and you're ready to sit down and validate stuff, and you're not starting from a state where it's just like some blast out from AI. And so I personally have been trying to take myself to the next level in terms of just managing AIs. I feel like I've gotten pretty good with that. And so now I'm like dialing in this feedback loop has kind of been the next iteration. And so I don't know what the next one is, but that is going to be it for the entire presentation. This turned out to be quite a bit longer than I thought. So I probably rambled on a few of these slides, and hopefully I didn't get too redundant there on some of the stuff, but if any of this stuff is interesting, there are a number of things that I didn't touch on. I didn't touch on security. Security is super important. How you do security is important. So there's a lot of different concepts out there on how to do that. I'm not going to talk about that. But if any of these, anything specifically here was interesting to you, and you would like to hear more from me about that, or you have specific questions, just go ahead and leave a comment down below. I'll review those comments later, and then I'll come back and consider doing another video where I do a similar style to this, where I do more of a presentation type of video and get into the details of how I'm managing specific aspects of what you guys might be interested in. And so that is where we're going to leave it for today. We will catch you on the next one. Peace, Quants.